Okay, the next hymn we're going to look at comes from Colossians chapter 1. Now, what I do when I read Paul's letters is I need a framework. And there have been a number of scholarly attempts in the last 50 years to create a chronology of Paul's letters, to sort out when they were written. Why is that important? Because if you have Galatians is the earliest letter, which a fair number of conservative scholars do, and then after that you have 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and then you have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, et cetera, on down the road. When you do this, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is going to create major problems. Because the kind of thinking that Paul is doing in these letters is very, very different than the kind of thinking he's doing in his other letters. I could never quite sort out why when I read Paul, I always thought he was a bit, I will just use the phrase, mentally challenged, or of two minds might be a better way to put it, because you read Paul and you're sitting there and you're going, Paul, you just said this, but now you're saying this. What is with you, dude? You know, everybody in Christ is equal, but women have to shut up in church. What is wrong with you? Okay, we've read Paul this way, and there's two reasons we've done this. One, we did not have a good chronology. When you put 1st and 2nd Thessalonians first in Paul's corpus, they're the first letters written, and then later on Galatians, Ephesians, etc., Philippians, all the other authentic Pauline letters, you recognize that something has happened for Paul between the writing of these letters and the writing of the rest of his letters. Something has happened. A change has occurred. Now, I've shared with you before that in the year 48 at Antioch, an event Paul records in Galatians chapter 2, there's a distinct break Paul makes with the Petrine Jerusalem church. He makes that break. He has to make that break in order to be able to stand his position at Antioch and draw the line in the sand. And you have to know, he was the only one on the other side of that line. Barnabas crossed, John Mark went over, because here's Peter and the James's contingent on this side and all the Antioch Christians over here, and Paul's on this side by himself, and he's saying, you don't get it. What you've just done is you've turned Christianity into a religion. You're expecting all the Gentiles to get circumcised, keep the Sabbath, eat kosher meals. That has nothing to do with the gospel. You don't get it. And he's drawn this line right here. He could not have drawn that line in the sand if he was still thinking like he thought in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. There would be no line in the sand. He would be on that side of the table. So in other words, Paul is thinking like the Jerusalem community until some time in the mid-40s. Now, Douglas Campbell dates 1st and 2nd Thessalonians to 41. He dates it to an event that's going to occur in Jerusalem where Caligula wants to set up a statue of himself in the temple. And he's able to make an excellent case for this really early dating of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Then he makes a phenomenal case that early in the year 50, Paul is imprisoned, and that's when he writes Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, and Ephesians. And then in late 50 to early 52 is a flurry of letter writing. Just a flurry of letter writing to Corinth, 2 letters or 3, Rome, Galatia. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm forgetting something. Oh, this is Philemon is up here. And the Thessalonian letters are there. Am I forgetting any other of Paul's letters? I don't think so. But all the great letters come here, you see. There is a decided shift. If you go on your own and read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, After our work today, when we've done these hymns, try to find that kind of thinking in these letters. You won't. You won't. What you'll find in the 1st and 2nd Thessalonian letters is evangelicalism and fundamentalism, Christian, but you won't find where Paul is. Paul makes a change. He has a theological change. He doesn't get a divine download in Damascus. He works, and then something happens. And then he sees the implications of this God event. What are the implications? So, again, whether Paul composes this hymn or whether it's something that's sung, I apologize, in the early church, I don't know. I haven't made up my mind. Walter Wink has an excellent essay where he's able to show that this particular hymn was taken over by the Gnostic Christians and then elaborated as part of their theology. And you'll notice as you look at this hymn, the language lends itself to Christian Gnosticism. But that's not where Paul's going. So let's look at this hymn. Okay, so beginning in verse 14, the hymn begins in verse 15, in whom we have the redemption. Is this not an exact same phrase from Ephesians? Now, I'll tell you something you can do if you want to have some fun one day. On the assumption that Paul kept copies of his own letters, which we do, right? On the assumption Paul kept copies of his own letters, Colossians is written first. And if you go read Ephesians, you'll find an awful lot of the sentences and phrasing in Colossians in Ephesians. In other words, Paul's cribbing his own work. Well, I did that in my recent book, Mimetic Theory and Biblical Interpretation, because I forgot I had a contract to write it, and then the publisher contacted me 2 weeks before the due date. I went, oops. And so I just kind of went and rewrote stuff that I had already put out in some odd places, and so we do that, So Paul does this. That's why you'll find the language in this hymn is going to be very similar to what you find in Ephesians. The difference is this. If Colossians, Thessalonians, Romans, Galatians, Philippians, these are all directed to communities. Ephesians, the text, the whole letter, is Paul's first attempt just to write out his theological model. Okay? Now, when you read Ephesians, you'll notice that it goes from world or universe to church, chapter 4. World is chapters 1 through 3. Church is chapter 4, to family, to person. Family is chapter 5, and community, family/community. And person is chapter 6. It moves like this, like a funnel. Well, Colossians is written to combat a certain form of philosophical thinking that had come into the Christian community there in Colossae, and Paul is just fit to be tied because it's a little bit of Jewish thinking, it's a little bit of Christian thinking. We call this Christian Gnosticism. It used to be thought that Gnosticism originated in Egypt. The most recent work suggests that Christian Gnosticism comes from Jewish Samaritanism. That's the Samaritans that would create Jewish Gnosticism that would end up in the Christian church. That may well be because the Samaritans had synagogues around the ancient world, just as the Judeans did. Okay, let's look at our hymn. In whom we have the redemption. What does the redemption consist of? What's the next phrase? Yes, have we seen that before in Paul? Yeah. So, the forgiveness of sins. Isn't that nice? So all the little sins you have done have been forgiven, because you went to confession or you asked God. Is that what Paul is saying? No. We're about to find out what constitutes the redemption. What constitutes the forgiveness of sins? How does this text begin in verse 15? What's the first word? Huh? He who. Who. See that who? Do you have a who in your translations? Oh, okay. This is the Greek text. In whom we have the redemption, the forgiveness of sins, who is the image of the invisible God. The who there tells you that it's a relative pronoun. In other words, Jesus' name stood here in the hymn. When the hymn is sung, it would be, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. But because Paul's quoting the him, he's now going to use a relative pronoun who with reference to Jesus. Okay, who, there's your one indicator you're dealing with a him. There's many, but this is one. Is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, or of every creature, of all that is made. In him all things were made in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones, authorities, rulers, or powers. All things through him and for him were made. How many times do you have the word all here? How broad is this? Sure, it's huge, isn't it? So you have one. In him all things were created, heaven and earth, visible and invisible. How inclusive is this? Is this just some things, or is Paul trying to say everything? And how does he even begin to articulate everything, all things, when he says visible and invisible, and then you get this list, whether thrones or lordships or powers or authorities, all things, and there it is again. Do you think we're having a bit of a cosmic vision here? Right? I mean, this is huge. Space, time, history, the stars, black holes, quarks, everything. And now here's the second verse. So you have the first verse, everything's made for him, everything that exists for him, it's all about Jesus. He is over all, and all things stand firm, remain in place because of him. And here's your second implication. He is the head of the body, the church. He, here's another hos, and you would begin another verse, is the beginning, the arche. Do you know where this term arche is going to occur? Do you know what arche is? It's the term for beginning. How about NRK, ein hologos? In the beginning was the logos. How about the opening words of the Gospel of Mark, the arche of the evangel, the beginning of the gospel? This word arche is hugely important in the New Testament because the case is being made that there's a new beginning, new starting point. This is the starting point. Jesus is. Not Adam's sin. Jesus' redemption is the starting point. Here's the problem with the West. I'm going to erase this for a moment just to help you see something. Ever since Augustine in the West, and because of the influence of the lawyer in the early 3rd century Tertullian, most Christian theology begins with this model: human. Fall into sin, and then redemption of somehow, some way. You have this model here. This is the Platonic model. That's Plato. And you can already see how the New Testament writers are taking this common model and totally upending it, completely upending it. Because here, humans go into sin, and God redeems them, and they go to heaven. What does that sound like? This is evangelicalism. Humans were good in the garden. This is Eden. This is Eden. This is paradise. And this is history. Right? And that's the model we're taught in the evangelical church, aren't we? I just showed you this U-shaped form, didn't I? What takes the place of human? Jesus does. So we'll put that in red. What takes the place of sin? You're right, but use the language that is being used by Paul in these letters. The redemption, the forgiveness of sins, right? You with me on this? This model is completely inverted. The focus is not on human sin. The focus is not on the problem. The focus is on the solution. It's on the solution. The evangelicals focus on the problem. And they start with the problem, and because they get the problem wrong, they get the solution wrong. They've mischaracterized what sin is. For them, sin is breaking moral codes. It's breaking the law. Now, here's another thing. I'm really going on rabbit trails here, but this will help you as you read Paul. In Judaism, you had, and I'm using Luther's terminology now, sin, death, and the devil on this side of the equation. What heals, what helps us move away from sin, death, and the devil in Judaism is Torah, or the law. Now, Paul comes along, he's going to restructure this. What he's going to do is he's going to look and he's going to go, yep, sin, death, and the devil are the problem, but where do we learn sin from? The law tells us, and that creates death, and then we're bound in evil. So what Paul does is he does this. He says, nope, if sin, death, and the devil are the problem, we're going to put Torah on this side of the equation, and it is the Holy Spirit of Jesus that is the solution. See that? That's the simple move Paul makes. And if you don't recognize that move, you're never going to get Paul. You with me on this? And by the way, this is J. Louis Martin, Doug Campbell, the post-new perspective on Paul. I'm not making this up. I'm just kind of following their lead. So you have this reframing of this meta-narrative here. The focus isn't on us. It's not on us. It's on God. It's on the redemption. It's not on the possibility of redemption. It's on the done deal. It's over. All things. When you look around you, does it look like all things have been redeemed? Why? Can you see it? No, because you're in the matrix. When you have done this thing in Philippians 2 and let go, you can see God at work in all the creation, every human being, foxes, sun, moon, stars, life, breath, wind, fire, everything. Life. Life is the Father's. The Father is life-giving. So, okay. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Devil. And, yeah. So let me know when you're ready and I'll move on. We'll continue to process this. But I'm just trying to help you see the shift in focus and why when evangelicals read Paul, they just got him totally wrong. Just totally wrong. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is Paul's issue, is how can he help his readers see? And one of the ways he can do that is to remind them of what they sing in churches on Sunday mornings, So he moves on. He is the head of the body of the church, who is the beginning, firstborn of the dead. That's the new beginning, firstborn of the dead. In order that he might have preeminence in all things. You see, there's another repetition of that all things business. Okay? Now here's this key phrase. In him, the fullness, all the fullness was pleased to dwell. It doesn't say all the fullness of God. If this is a term out of Greek philosophy, the fullness. And it just simply means that which is, it's a way of our talking about God, of divinity. But Paul uses this philosophical category to say, whatever you think is the fullness of the universe, that's in Jesus. The fullness was pleased to dwell in him. And through him to reconcile just the charismatics. No, just the Baptists. No, it's a textual variant. Just the Catholics. No, it says, what does it say? Just to reconcile what? All things to himself. Making peace through the blood of his cross. Whether things on earth or things in heaven. All things. Material, non-material. All things. How many times in this text did we see that? Just as we saw in the Colossians text, in Christ, in him, Christ, through him. You see that same language here. This Paul is a seriously Jesus-centered fanatic, isn't he? Hugely so. And whatever it is that God does in Jesus is not what Billy Graham and all the other nut jobs say. What God has done is redeemed the universe, creation, space, time, history, everything. It's a done deal. And that peacemaking occurs through the forgiveness of sins. I mean, it's just amazing to stop and think about it. What would human history look like right now if instead of seeking retribution, every human being, when they were hurt by another person, said, I forgive you? Okay, well, let's forget that. Let's just say the church. What if every follower of Jesus, every time they were hurt, said, I forgive you? Would the church look different? Oh, boy. So here's this cosmic Christ hymn. The focus, you'll notice in here, the only time the church is mentioned is because Jesus is the head of the body. There's nothing in here about whether you believe this, if you have faith in it. None of that. None of that. The gospel is not about us. We got to get that through our heads. It is about God's good news of God's character toward us. It's about our redemption, but it's about God redeeming us. The subject of the sentence in theology, if it is going to be Christian theology, must always be God and never I. And that's how we counter subjectivity in theology. We use this perspective that Paul brings to the table, what the post-new perspective thinkers call this apocalyptic invasion of God. This here's humanity doing this thing, and God just comes in, smashes it apart, invades it, and it's done. It's over. And now it's just being played out in the underbelly of human history. And you'll notice there's not 1,000 people in this room today. If I did the whole Pentecostal charismatic make you feel good thing and I could easily pack an auditorium with 1,000. We'd have an overflow problem. The reality is the gospel is simple and it's also difficult. And it's absolutely terrifying to take that red pill, because the moment you take that red pill and go down the rabbit hole into the work of God, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, your life will change. You will learn to love, you will learn to forgive, you will learn to make peace, you will learn to be gentle, nurturing, caring, kind, compassionate, hospitable, all these things, because that's the character of God, and that's the last thing that Christians want to be. Oh, they say it from the pulpit, you got to be patient like Job. They say these things, but they don't live them. They don't articulate them, And so the moment somebody bombs our country, all the Christian churches go all patriotic and want to go bomb them. You begin to wonder here, where's the disconnect in this? And the disconnect is they don't have a singular principle in their theology, ethics, and spirituality. Their God is violent, therefore they can be violent, and therefore God can be violent to them when they pray. Why did that bad thing happen to you? I was disobeying God. All that logic is religious logic, and it's all that logic that Paul says Christ has come to just absolutely just destroy this kind of thinking. And Paul says, if God comes to destroy that kind of thinking, replace it with a kind of thinking, and we already saw in the last session that kind of thinking has fundamentally to do with just learning to let go, not to be non-mimetic, to be compassionate, merciful, all these things that we've talked about. And this is the Colossians hymn. You'll notice that the verse 16 in particular, there's an echo of all of this down in verse 18, where he's given preeminence over everything, right? Now, does it sound like from this text that Jesus was created by God? He is the firstborn of all creation. This created a huge problem in the early church. There was a fellow named Arius in the late 3rd century in Alexandria, where also Athanasius was with his bishop Alexander. And Arius said the first thing God created was Jesus. And then through Jesus, God creates all things. But Jesus is created. He's not co-eternal with the Father. The early church had a hissy fit, because if Jesus is created, then he's not God. They couldn't figure out how this could be. And so they did all the metaphysical convolutions of Nicaea, and God of God, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made. That's where you get that language. He's eternally generated. He's eternally begotten. He's not created. All this language in the creed comes right out of a text like this, where Arius is saying, see, Jesus was created. Now, here's the thing. I don't really know so much that it matters to Christian theology proper whether you say Jesus was created by God and then through all things were created, or if you say the Son was co-eternal with the Father. The fact is, before all things are created, the Son is the present. You with me on this? And the Son, at least at this point, appears to be good enough for the Father to create all things through. You see what I'm saying? So I'm not sure that we need to quibble about all these things that are happening in certain circles out there today. What we have to recognize here is that this is making a claim. This is making a huge claim. And that claim is that everyone you see is reconciled by God, to God. They just don't know it. And that means that they're reconciled to you and to me, and they just don't know it. And I'm reconciled to you and to you and to you and to you, and I just don't know it. We're all family. I just don't know it. What do I need? I need someone to treat me like family. I want to tell you, there's only one conversion story in the Bible. There's only one Christian conversion story in the New Testament. It's the only one that exists. And it's the story of Paul on the road to Damascus. And we say Paul was converted on the road to Damascus. We're not paying attention. You got to pay attention to the text. You notice how I'm paying attention? I'm saying, what's it say? What's it say? Paul is blinded on the road to Damascus. And it's the question of his violence that blinds him. Why do you persecute me? Boom! He's stumbling around blind. I don't know. He's put back on his horse. He's led into Damascus, and he's going, where are you taking me? Where are we going? And they say to him, we're going to take you to the house of the people you're threatening to kill. Now, you're blind. You can't see anything. Can you defend yourself? So you're brought into the house of the very people that you're going to kill, right? You come into that house and you're blind. How are you feeling? Somebody comes, throws a bag over your head, tosses you in the back of the van. You end up being handcuffed to a chair in a basement somewhere with some weirdo serial killer standing over you. How do you feel? Come on. Come on, you're terrified. You're peeing your pants, aren't you? Right. But in this case, terrified. I mean, it's like, when's the knife in the back going to come kind of thing. Walks into this house. These are the people that he has just hated, just so much so that you need to stone Stephen, you have my authority to do so. Walks into this house. Do you recall from the book of Acts, the very first word that is said to Paul by Ananias, the homeowner of the house that Paul is led to? The first word. Brother. Brother Saul. And the text says, the shingles fell from his eyes. He was made family. Brother. He was not an enemy. He was treated as brother. That's what Saul saw. Somehow, he had been included in this non-retaliation. He should, by all rights, be dead. But he's been forgiven. You see? And that's the community that did that. That's why I say, for example, you never, ever, 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 ever know when the next Apostle Paul is going to walk into your life. You just never know. And again, the gospel has never been about numbers. Numbers don't mean anything. It's about persons and groups that are just absolutely committed to learning to live this vision of peace and love together. That's where the light is, and that's what happened to Paul, and I suspect that's where real so-called evangelism takes place, is when we allow our enemies in and we name them as sisters and brothers, part of this big family thing. Okay, that's why I totally object to the church out there. You go to so many churches, we're the family of God, we're the family of God. I want to go bullshit. Where's your enemies? If your enemies were here and you were breaking bread together, they'd go, oh yeah, you're the family of God. But the fact is, you're all just a bunch of sycophants, just following the leader. Let's follow he's the Pied Piper, whatever he says. No. It's not how it works. It's being able to sit in a pew next to somebody that you normally can't stand and loving them. Anyway, I'll move on. So this is Colossians 2. How are we doing on time? I have no idea. Oh, it's early. Ooh, we might get a lot more done than we want. Could be fun. So do you see this hymn? Now, do you at any place have this U-shaped thing that we saw in Philippians? Is it here? When you look at the text, is there an above, a below, and an above? It is more subtle, but go ahead, tell me where you identify the first part of the above. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's the below. That the resurrection takes place in the below, right? Mm-hmm. So you'll notice also in this text that where is it? First, that raised from the dead occurs before the mention of the cross. Interesting, eh? No, is it Colossians chapter 1? Oh, I apologize. Colossians chapter 1. So verses 15 through essentially 17 is the above. And then 18 through 20 is the below. You'll notice that this above here is not directly referenced, but you'll notice that if normally you'd have cross resurrection, but by placing resurrection before cross, there's your above right there. So it's there, it's subtle, it's not as clear as Philippians 2, nor will it, and in John 1, you'll see the same thing. And if you looked at 1 Timothy 3:16, it's the same structure. This is the gospel. This, not Eden, human, sin, heaven, but creation of all things, redemption of all things, and the holistic restoration of all things. We just live down here between the times. We're just here. That's the structure. And where does it begin? It begins with God. The gospel is about God. Gospel, good news about God. Restoration, or, Well, a reconciliation happens at the cross. You could talk about restoration, new creation, however you're going to, whatever metaphor you want to use to articulate that beyond death is life that is whole. Shalom, real shalom. Yeah. All right. You with me so far? Let's try one other small one. We're going to shift gears entirely. We're going to leave Paul. We're going to look at the opening of a sermon. It's we call it the letter to the Hebrews, or the epistle to the Hebrews. It's actually not an epistle, it's a sermon, a written down sermon. And we don't know who the author is. It's not Paul, for sure it's not Paul. And this author is going to do a major theological reflection on this figure of Jesus in relationship to Jewish mediators. Folks, there is no religion without a mediator. Whether in Judaism, in Second Temple Judaism, in Jesus' era, Richard Bauckham, Margaret Barker, and there's so much research that's been done on this, has shown that in the views of many of the different groups, and also in the country folk, the regular rural folk, which was the masses, while they believed in God, there were mediators, whether they were angels or the demonic, or Moses was a mediator between God and humanity, Elijah, another one, So we, in our tradition, the Christian tradition, we start with Jesus, but we move to the saints, Mother Mary, the priest, and then, of course, you get Protestantism and the pastors, the mediator. You cannot have religion without a mediator. You have to have a priest. You have to have a functionary, someone that goes between you and the divine. And this is what Hebrews is articulating is, okay, so we have to have a mediator. Let's talk about our mediator. Let's talk about Jesus. And how is he superior to other mediators? What is it that makes his mediation of this one called God so revelatory, profound, etc.? And so in the epistle to the Hebrews, if you'll turn with me to chapter 1, and we'll start there, and then we'll take another break here. I'm only going to begin the text with you and ask you to note a few things. So Hebrews chapter 1. Now, again, I like to throw tidbits out, okay? This writer to the Hebrews, there are really 4 writers in the New Testament that are absolutely brilliant in command of the Greek language. Paul, the writer of the Gospel of John, the writer of Luke Acts, and the writer of Hebrews. And the writer of Hebrews is the one that appears to be the most well-trained. Because I will read this to you in Greek, and all I want you to do in just this first opening line is listen to the number of P sounds, the words that start with P. With me? This is just the opening sentence. In various times, in various ways, God has spoken to the fathers through the prophets. And I will emphasize, this is a writer who's trying to hammer a point home. Polumeros kai polutropos palai hothaos lalisas tus patrasin en tis prophetais. All those P's, This is it's a rhetorical style. It's meant to get your attention. Through various means in many ways, God spoke to the fathers through the prophets. Already in verse 1, what do you got? Mediation. With me? In other words, Paul could have said, through many ways and various means, God spoke to the fathers. And, but in these last days, he's spoken to us in his Son. Why does this writer include the phrase, through the prophets? Why would he do that? Why didn't he just say God spoke to the fathers? What's about to come? Okay, now, notice verse 2. In these last days, this is, again, that Greek term eschatos, in these final days. These are people that experience this thing, Jesus thing, so profoundly, they thought it was the end of one thing and the beginning of another. They just had no idea that this thing would endure. So they're right here. In these last days, he has spoken to us by a Son. And then what's the very next word, guys? Who, and what do we have here? Who. Now, all this language you're going to look at in verse 3 comes from Judaism. If you were to read Proverbs 8, you would find this kind of language with reference to Sophia, or wisdom. If you were to read the wisdom of Solomon, same thing. Who is the character of glory? I'm sorry, not character. Hypogasma. How does your text translate hypogasma? Radiance, thank you. Yeah, that's one of those words that hardly occurs in the New Testament. Who is the radiance of glory and the character of his hypostasis. This term, hypostasis, is the term the Greek church uses. The Latin church uses the word persona, person. God is 3 persons. The Eastern church says God is 3 modes of being or 3 ways of being. So here you have this term, hypostasis, who is the radiance of glory and character of God's hypostasis, bearing what? Bearing what? Tapanta. All things. Oh my God, there it is again. You saw it in Ephesians 1, all things. You saw it in Colossians 1, all things. You got it here in this hymn in Ephesians 1, all things. How do you suppose the early Christians perceived the work of God? That is the early Christians that weren't part of the Jewish Christian community. How did they perceive the work of God? As affecting all things, yeah. The Jews in Jerusalem over here, who did the work of God affect? The Jews. Yeah, that's right. And it's the Pauline, John communities out here that are going, oh no, this is a whole lot bigger than that. See? And do you see how it's embedded in all these hymns so far? Wait till we get to the Gospel of John. It's the same thing. Now, he bears all things by the word of his power, having made a cleansing of sins, he is seated at the right hand of majesty on high. Do you see the you here? Who is in is the radiance of God's glory and the character of God, goes down, makes notice the language here, a cleansing, and there is a reference to the exaltation on high to the right hand of majesty. Now, does Paul use this language? No. Paul doesn't really he uses some of this language as we saw in Colossians, but it's not as full-blown. And when Paul talks about the death of Christ, he doesn't tend to use priestly metaphors of cleansing. And when he talks about Jesus being exalted, he typically does not use language, the right hand of the majesty on high. But you see the structure in the hymn. With me on this? Where does it start? God. The problem is never emphasized. It is always about the solution. And that's what distinguishes the New Testament gospel from Protestant Christendom in all of its forms. Okay. This is the gospel. This is what distinguishes Protestant Christendom in all of its forms, is because Christendom begins with the problem. What's the problem? The problem is sin. What's the solution? And if you start there and you define the problem wrong, I mentioned this earlier. What is sin? And we use that term because somebody somewhere decided that because hamartia was used in a certain text about archery, that it's a missing of the mark. There's a number of different metaphors that you go with this. But if you need a definition of sin that I think is very, very Pauline, it would be this. And this comes from a colleague of mine, Denny Moon. Sin is the destructive way we handle our pain. Sin is the destructive way we handle our pain. Now, if sin is the destructive way we handle our pain, it has nothing to do with moral codes, rules, external rules that one simply abides by in order to receive blessing and avoid cursing. If sin is the destructive way we handle our pain, sex can be good or it can be destructive. Alcohol can be good or it can be destructive. Religion can be good, or church, not religion. Church can be good or it can be destructive. If we are in pain and we are using something to numb that pain, or if we are in pain and we are passing that pain on through anger, hostility, you see, if we're doing that, we're destroying relationships. And sin is the destructive way we handle our pain and destroy our relationships. That's sin. Now, if that's the problem, if you identify sin this way, then the solution is to create an alternative to handling pain, isn't it? Now, if I use all the bad language in the book, wah, just dump it on Jay. Wah, I say all this nasty stuff. You go crazy. Now, there's a lot of pain here, and there are ways that this pain can be dealt with. And so, for me, I'm a self-sabotager. So if I'm preaching in a church of 100 people and 99 come out and say, I like the sermon, thank you very much, it really inspired me, and one person says, I didn't like it at all, I'm going to go home on Sunday and sit there and just only think about the one. And then I'm going to come back the next Sunday and I'm going to preach a sermon that's directed against the one but offends a dozen, and there's this self-sabotaging that goes on. That's how I handle my pain. Or I used to, back in the days in 94 and following, I used to just drink myself crazy. How do we handle pain if we are going to be those who follow Jesus? Here's pain. What do you do with it? Let it go. So if I hurt you like this, you can come back at me, you can retaliate, or you can be the one that models Jesus and just forgives, because you can look and go, you know what, Michael? You can say, Michael, you don't know what you're doing. Or you can say, Michael, you're just clueless. Either way, the forgiveness is extended. No, in other words, we let pain from others and violence from others go through us. We don't let it stop here. And that's so important. We just let it go right on through us. Because if we let it stop here, now we've got it. And what do we got to do with it? If we've got it, we've got to pass it on. Why do you think they teach us games like hot potato when we're little kids? You know what I mean? And the ultimate game about scapegoating, musical chairs, right? There's an intuition in these games we don't get. Now, I totally forgot where I was in that thought, but I really should show you something, too, about this text. Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 9. This is a text you'll get confronted with, so I might as well show you how I handle the text. I hope it'll be helpful. So what's Hebrews 9:22 say? Somebody read. Why did Jesus have to die? According to this text, the way it's traditionally interpreted, why did Jesus have to die? Well, it doesn't say that. What does the text say? Why did Jesus have to die? What's the text say? The law requires everything be cleansed with blood. Okay? Jesus had to die because there's a mess and it has to be fixed. But how does the text articulate in 9:22 how the fix is made? Shedding of blood. Sacrifice. And so the evangelicals come to a text like this and they say, see, God needed Jesus' blood. Because if God didn't have Jesus' blood, he couldn't forgive our sins. God needed Jesus to die. And then, of course, you extend that metaphor all the way out into Calvinism. God was angry and needed Jesus' blood to assuage his anger so that he could be nice to us. That's how far you can extend that out. Have you heard the verse interpreted that way? Used this way? Right? Yeah. Now follow me. Right? Now I'm going to show you why you never believed it. This is the thing about people that are on this journey. Intuitively, they've got it. I just have to give them the support system so they can tell the evangelicals how silly they are. Follow me down to chapter 10, because we're going to come back to 9:22 in a moment. You have this whole critique of the priesthood, the covenant, the tabernacle, and Moses, and just how everything that Jesus does is superior to this whole sacrificial apparatus. It appears like the author is saying that this whole sacrificial apparatus of the Old Testament was put in place in order to show us that Jesus was God's real sacrifice. That's what it appears this author is doing, but he's not doing that at all. He's not doing that at all. He sets up the whole sacrificial system in order to say, that wasn't what God was about. He's doing the same thing that Jeremiah did in chapter 7 when Jeremiah said, God didn't write Leviticus. You guys did. Okay, same move. How do I know this? Two pieces. The first you already read. Through many ways and various means, God spoke to the fathers through the prophets. You know what's funny? Preachers preach this and they go, yeah, there were dreams and visions and this and that and the other. You know what I'm saying? You'll notice they never, ever, ever, ever include texts. Because if they did, the author's asserting that Jesus is superior to scriptural text. And they can't have that. And so they ignore it. They delete it. They elide it. And so we're going, oh, yeah, God's spoken dreams. God's spoken visions. Now he's spoken through a son. Oh, cool. But it's the Bible that really tells us all this. This is not the logic of this text. He's also going to include, like Paul does, text. Okay? Now notice with me 10:5. So you have this critique of things, and there's this fascinating phrase in 10:5. Therefore, upon entering the world, he says. And we get a psalm, a citation of a psalm. Look, and what psalm is it? Psalm 40. Now watch this. Therefore, when he entered the world, he said. Who's he? Yeah, Jesus. It's a reference to Jesus, isn't it? So, here's the Father, here's the Son, here's the Holy Ghost. They're done playing pinochle for the evening. They're having their last beer and a snack. And the Father says, Jesus, I think it's time, And Jesus says, well, I'll tell you what, let me finish my pizza and beer, and then I'll go down into the womb of the Virgin Mary. And the Holy Spirit says, this sounds about right. I'll join you. And the Father says, do you know what I want? And the Son looks at the Father and says, it ain't sacrifice. Sacrifice and burnt offering you don't desire. You don't even want sin offerings and bull offerings. But a body you've prepared for me. I've come to do your will. This is an anti-sacrificial text. The purpose of the incarnation was not sacrifice. Jesus did not come to die. Jesus came to live. The Father did not need the death of Jesus. We did. That's Paul's logic in Romans 3:23-26. So notice, he quotes Psalm 40, and then the only time in the New Testament where a writer is going to say to you, the reader, the reason I'm citing this biblical verse is because. Notice writers just say, it is written, it is written, it is written, it is written, right? How does your translation read in verse 8? Ooh. They were offered what? Katanomo. So, is he saying that the law required sacrifices? Did God? No. No. Now go back to 9:22. That exact same phrase, katatonomon, according to the law. What do you read? The shedding of blood for the forgiveness of sins is required according to the law, not God, and it's right there. Chapter 10 just shreds that reading of 9:22 that the evangelicals put on it. Doesn't it? Same thing, right there. What do you want to know?
Just because it makes it a little muddy. We have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all.
Ha 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 ha. There's that word sacrifice, right? Oh no. Oh no. Gotta love. If I wasn't being recorded, I'd use an adjective starts with F with regard to translators sometimes. However, the verb thuo in Greek is to sacrifice. Thusia is the noun, sacrifice. This is the verb, to sacrifice. With me so far? Now, there's other language that's used for things that come to the altar. What are they called? Offerings. And so in Hebrews, you have all of these cognates of pharaoh, prosphero, diaphero, anaphero, etc., which means to offer. Offer. An offering is different than a sacrifice. Sacrifice always involves another. Offering only involves the self. Now, I want to show you what this writer does. He's absolutely a genius. When a priest comes to the altar, it is the priest and the sacrifice. The priest sacrifices the animal and moves on. Hebrews puts the verb to offer with the personal pronoun heauto, himself. So in Hebrews, you constantly find he offered himself. You with me? Not he sacrificed himself. You don't find that language. Or you don't find the language he became a sacrifice. Okay? You find he offered himself. That is, the priest becomes the victim, the lamb. You with me? But it's an offering. No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. It's an offering. It's a sacrifice. There's no choice. You know, you're just going to get, it's a done deal. But if you're going forward as an offering, different deal. The verb that's used here is prosphero, offering. Your translators have rendered it sacrifice. So when you read it as an English reading person, you're going to go, but it says Jesus is through his sacrifice. It doesn't say that. It says through the offering of his body. Through the offering of his body. The prosphoros, from prosphora, offering. The writer to the Hebrews uses this language, with the thuo language, with reference to the sacrificial system. But he uses this language of pharaoh, prosphero, diaphero with reference to the work of Christ. And that's the shift from sacrificial to non-sacrificial. Again, this is another writer that gets it and makes that move, just like Paul makes, just like John will make, just like Luke and Mark make. That Matthew's community doesn't get, the revelator of, doesn't get, Peter doesn't get, James doesn't get, This is that move. That's that move. If you're Jewish Christianity, where are you worshiping? In the temple. And what's going to be important to you? Sacrifice. And as part of the logic of that, God blesses the good, curses the bad, right? And the bad people, where do they go? To Gehenna. And that's why you'll notice it's only Matthew's gospel that has all those sayings where Jesus is saying you're gonna burn in hell. There's going to be eternal worms and fire and this and that. No, I know that. It's Gehenna, but Matthew has the Gehenna sayings, and you know that. And I use the term hell as a generic category because most people don't know that. But the point is, only Matthew's gospel has those sayings. His book comes out of Antioch, the place where Paul and stood against Peter and James and lost. Matthew's gospel reflects this Jewish Christian thinking, which includes a retributive God at the end of time. And so Jesus is too pansy-wansy for him from Mark's gospel, so he takes Mark's gospel and rewrites it in terms of his own thinking and turns Jesus into this kind of nasty evangelical. It's a problem. Well, he's writing to the Jewish Christians, yeah. But in other words, Matthew's community puts sayings into the mouth of Jesus that reflect their theology, just like pastors do when they say, God told me. Okay? And so the Jewish Christian literature, that Jewish Christian literature oriented to Jerusalem, I should say, you'll see it Jude, little letter of Jude, Revelation, 1 Peter, 2 Peter. You even start to see it in the fake Pauline letters that are written later, Timothy and Titus. They're not written by Paul. You start to see it a little bit there. Like you see it in 1 and 2 Thessalonians. right? But again, you have this logic being subverted over and over and over again, and it's this anti-sacrificial logic that becomes the lyrics for their songs. All these early Christian songs are about the self-offering of God, so that as we dwell in this, we become offerings ourselves. It's that simple. Do you see it? But they're having to undo so much garbage. It's really not complex. It's the garbage that's a mess. It's like, doing theology reminds me sometimes of somebody giving me to the county sanitation dump site and a teaspoon and saying, I need you to move this dump site from here to there. That's sometimes what it's like, deconstructing theology. It's like, So, okay, how we doing? Okay, this is important to me. Am I making this up, or is it in the text? Right? It's there. I mean, I'm not trying to, I am interpreting the text, but I'm trying to help you see that I'm trying not to do what the evangelicals do, which is to presume the meaning of a text. I'm trying to ask, what's going on in this author's head? And then I need to go, if I'm sitting in the congregation and this is being read, what's going on in my head? I'm not my congregation today, but my congregation 2,000 years ago. I'm sitting there hearing this. What am I hearing? Do that, and then I can do the work, what am I hearing today? Okay. Questions, thoughts? So Genesis 22, you have a Bible. Go ahead, come on, Bible study. Yeah, Genesis 22, it's all good. What I need you to do is read this story. In Judaism, it is known as the Akedah, which is simply the word for binding. It is the binding of Isaac. It's a really important story in Judaism for a number of reasons. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have you look at this text, because this text is going to play with you. And what you're looking for as you read this text are, when you read this, okay, I don't want to prejudice you. So when's the last time you actually looked at the words of the story and paid attention to the way the narrator's narrating it? Huh? You did it Sunday. You're amazing. But most of us haven't read this story in a long time. So let